Okay, we're live.
Okay, yeah, so we have this video from the Money and Macro YouTube channel. The guy who does this is named Yuri, and he's a money viewer, so he's a follower of Perry Maerling, and I've watched some of his stuff in the past. I have not watched this video yet, but it is looking at the Give Directly experiment in Africa, where they hand a bunch of people in a village free money and they see what happens. And a lot of people kind of say that this is the best experiment or pilot of universal basic income, the one that kind of gives us the most information because you're doing it for a whole village, that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's the best because it's the biggest one, right? Because people in rural Kenya are living on like $3 a day or something, so you can actually fund a lot of real basic incomes with charitable donations there, and it's a lot harder to do that like almost anywhere else in the world, right? And scale is what we always object to. We always say that all these UBI pilots, it's not really UBI because it's too small. Not enough people get it.
Yeah, I'm still skeptical of this one as well. Because, well, it certainly tests what happens to people when you give them free money. It tests what happens when you kind of inject money into a village, I suppose. But does it address any of the kind of important questions that we bring up? Like, how does it affect the macroeconomy? How would it interact with monetary policy? How does it trade off against kind of using monetary policy to stimulate the financial sector and create jobs and that kind of thing? And my sense is that it is not going to tell us about that.
So if I understand correctly, they do basically like they used to give it to they used to qualify like individual people or households to receive or not the basic income, but like people got like jealous and thought that they were like colluding with the people or something, and sort of like burning houses down for the people that were getting it. So then they started doing it on like a whole village basis. So it's a saturation site at the level of individual villages, and it's a lot of villages. So I don't know how big it has to be to answer the macroeconomic questions, but it seems like I don't know. We'll play the video. We'll see.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm curious to see what he has to say here. So let's go. Okay, so these are interesting things. Now, if you're worried about inflation or monetary stability, then and you believe, kind of the Milton Friedman story, then you kind of need to keep the kind of amount of money in the economy fixed in order to achieve monetary stability. So if you're adding more money to the economy in a Friedman world, then it automatically kind of causes inflation. Not quite that simple, but that's kind of like the simplified version of it. The John Maynard Keynes thing is interesting because it's kind of talking about a different thing. It's kind of presupposing that you have monetary stability, that you don't have inflation, that you add more money, and that kind of adds more real spending power to the economy. And then there's the secondary thing of the money multiplier, where you add X amount of dollars to the economy, and then it increases the amount of spending or production or employment or something in the economy by some multiple of that. So you get this kind of money multiplier. If you're thinking about money multipliers, it kind of matters if you have like a certain finite amount of money and you're trying to get the most bang for your buck. The higher the money multiplier, basically, the more bang for your buck you get. But do we care about bang for buck when we're thinking about universal basic income implemented at the level of the macroeconomy? And my sense is that the answer is no. We don't care how much bang each individual buck has. We care about whether resources are being allocated efficiently, and whether money is being distributed efficiently, and we will have as much money in the economy as needed to achieve that goal, right? And that's going to imply some, I guess, money multiplier. There's going to be some response in the economy to having the right amount of money. But in terms of like what the multiplier is, higher isn't necessarily better. There's such a thing as like it just means that you have less money to achieve the same effect. That kind of thing. So neither one of these things is really relevant to understanding universal basic income, because universal basic income, like I always like to point out, is that it's not more money, it's a different source of money for the economy, right? So this give directly experiment is really testing what happens when you add kind of more money to the economy in this specific way, but it's not testing, kind of one money distribution mechanism versus another at the level of the macroeconomy. So that's what I have to say so far based on the first 39 seconds. You guys ready to continue or have any thoughts?
I guess just the multiplier, like, I think it's very, I think intuitively it makes sense for people to think like, if you're going, like, let's say if the government's going to spend money into the economy, like if you can get more production and more demand from that given amount of dollars, that sounds like efficient. It sounds like you're getting more bang for your buck, like you said. But like, I mean, what's the difference between, in our view? Like, we're sort of saying, we're imagining typically that the total amount of spending is kind of maximized either way. So the number of times that a particular dollar circulates, and then the total amount of dollars that are actually being spent, I guess those are different things. So if you're imagining total amount is like constrained to its maximum amount either way, then, like, what's the major difference, I guess? What help me understand, like if I was someone who really felt that getting more circulation out of, say, $100 or $1,000 or $1 million, if you can get more circulation out of that, what's the problem with that?
Well, if you feel that way, you're probably imagining that you have access to a finite amount of dollars and you're trying to get the largest effect from those dollars possible, right? Whereas, and if that's the situation you're in, then yes. If you're the macroeconomic policymakers, for the United States or something like that, you're not in that situation. You don't have a finite amount of dollars that you're trying to kind of get the most.
But there's a finite amount of spending the government can spend, right? Government spending's not.
There's a finite amount of total spending in the economy, and there's a level and pattern of spending that the economy can sustain, that's consistent with monetary stability. But if you have a lower multiplier, you can have more base money to achieve that same level of spending, right?
Yeah. So like the money, it doesn't make sense to think of the money itself as a finite, limited resource if you're in the position of someone who's managing the whole economy, when you're the one who's managing money and creating money, and you have that power. Like there's a finite amount of spending that the economy can handle, a finite amount of real goods and services. But when if somebody thinks you get more bang for your buck because of multiplier effects, they're not talking about like a more efficient economy that makes more stuff per dollar spent. They're talking about like the same dollar gets spent more times because it circulates around. That's what they're getting at with multiplier effects, right?
Yeah, and it goes from business to business, generates employment and output and that kind of thing. Yeah. If we're just trying to kind of maximize what the economy can do, then we can put the money in there to do that, and we can kind of derive a multiplier from that. We can say like, okay, there's X amount of spending, and it took this amount of base money, therefore that's a certain multiple, right?
Yeah, okay. But it's irrelevant, right? You don't necessarily care how many times a dollar that you pump into the economy gets spent, because the dollars themselves are not the limited thing. You can pump as many dollars in as it takes to maximize the economy's productive capacity.
Right. The resources are what constrains the economy.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, let's keep going.
Yeah.
If you could slow it down just a little bit, I'm having trouble following.
Okay, I'll slow it down. Did giving up free money lift people out of poverty? And I feel like this is one of these questions that's kind of, like, yeah, obviously when people have more money, they're better off. Like, this is not, I mean, as long as whatever you did to add more money didn't break something in the economy that caused people to be worse off.
Well, I mean, the important thing that they're talking about in this video really is that it didn't cause inflation in like the local area or nearby communities, even though, yeah.
So
Like,
that
I
meant
feel-
there were resources that could have been going into these communities that weren't going into these communities, that adding the money to the communities kind of freed up those resources or made them available to the communities.
Yeah, I think the distinction they might be asking is like, did it lift people out of poverty, or did it, do nothing, cause inflation, cause prices to go up? That's sort of maybe how they would be thinking about it.
Right. Yeah. And I think anytime you're in a situation where there could be more resources going to people, when there are resources going unused, then it's possible to activate those resources without causing inflation.
Yeah, they talk about that later, about how the economy in this case was demand constrained, right? So
Yeah.
when people have more money, people just make more stuff
Yeah,
because
yeah.
there's a lot of slack in the economy, which is great, right? So yeah, let's go.
Yeah, let's keep going. So obviously, development aid is a different question from the question that we like to ask about universal basic income. We're not trying to like solve the problem of like how to kind of, again, get the most bang for our buck in development aid. We're trying to solve the problem of how to distribute money into the economy compared to how it's currently being done through macroeconomic policy.
Income of all people in a certain area is GDP, or what happens to all prices at the same time, inflation. Like other scientists, macroeconomists follow the scientific method, which involves using theory to formulate a hypothesis, testing that hypothesis through experiments preferably, and then analyzing the data from these experiments and then confirming or rejecting the hypothesis. However, when it comes to experiments, macroeconomists face a much greater challenge than other small-scale social sciences. For example, in medicine, the gold standard for experiments are so-called randomized controlled trials, RCTs for short. In such a trial, there are typically two groups. The first group is the intervention group, which receives the treatment, or intervention being tested. The second group is a control group, which does not receive the treatment. To ensure that the two groups are as similar to each other as possible, subjects are then randomly assigned to either groups. If an RCT is done correctly and we compare the start and end results of both groups, we can be pretty sure that if there is a change in the intervention group, but not in the control group, this change was caused by the intervention. There are, of course, ethical considerations when testing anything with human subjects. However, RCTs are considered a relatively fair way of distributing aid, especially in cash. After all, there is never enough aid for everyone in need, so if we're going to distribute aid to a limited number of people anyways, doing it randomly is both fair and it allows.
So this is again, there's never enough aid. Is it that there's never enough money? There's never enough resources? You're trying, again, it's kind of this bang for your buck question that I feel like is pretty central to kind of what they're investigating here.
To study the impact. Randomized controlled trials have already revolutionized how individual development aid programs are evaluated. For example, a recent evaluation of over 100 randomized controlled trials has shown that unconditional cash transfers generate strong and positive average treatment effects, such that those that received cash had significantly higher incomes, food security, and psychological well-being. They owned more and could afford more. Their children were going to school more and were less likely to die before they reached 5 years old.
So people are better off if they have more money. That's not answering the question of kind of what's the most efficient, most effective way to distribute the money.
Yeah, I mean, Give Directly has always been sort of two things at once, right? It's always on the one hand, first and foremost, it's been testing cash transfers as a way of helping people, right? Like you have this problem where you're an international charity, you have a certain amount of money you collect that you raise, and you want to help people as efficiently as you can with it. Well, have you tried just giving them the money instead of trying to guess what it is that they need and want, and then buying them like medicine or textbooks or education or something, right? And like I totally agree with their philosophy on this. I think and I think the evidence speaks for itself. Cash transfers are a very efficient way to help people, and one of the great successes of Give Directly is that they became like the baseline for international aid, like places like GiveWell.org, where they try and like rate all these different charities by how much bang for your buck you get when you donate to them. They tend to use Give Directly as a baseline because, like, if you think you can do better than just giving somebody the money, then well, you better have a good idea, right? Because people are experts in their own needs and their own wants.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. the direct cash kind of sets a benchmark. And if you have some cash, can you do better than just handing it out to people? But that's yes, and that's a different question from the question that we ask about, and the kinds of questions we ask about universal basic income.
But we'll get to that stuff. Sorry, let's go.
Yep.
Well, it's also interesting to note that the question of whether I find this video interesting because I think it's very much like you mentioned, Phil, the give directly organization. There's kind of this two-handed approach to it where they're looking at UBI as aid. But then the real whole premise of the video is actually asking kind of macroeconomic questions. We're bringing in Keynes and Friedman. So it's kind of there's kind of a weird blurring of the lines here between whether we're looking at UBI as aid or whether we're looking at it as something that affects the macroeconomy, something that affects total consumption, something like that.
Yeah, it's interesting because they are asking macroeconomic questions, but the questions they're asking are more along the lines of, if you inject too much money into the economy in this way, does it cause inflation or something like that? Whereas we would ask the question differently. We would ask, maybe, given the monetary stability constraint, kind of how much money can the economy handle flowing through it? How much money can the economy handle flowing through it using these various faucets, these various money faucets versus, are you directly handing cash to each individual consumer? Are you using easy monetary policy to stimulate credit expansion and create jobs? What are the various kind of ways that money can be flowing into the economy? And yeah, how does that affect how much money there is? But also, how does it affect how it activates the resources in the economy?
But even on a more fundamental level, I guess what I'm trying to point out is the whole perspective of whether you're approaching a given policy or idea as aid, like foreign aid, or like economic management, are kind of two really different options, two totally different ways of approaching policy. Like foreign aid is sort of about like, we've generated a whole bunch of wealth over here, we enjoy this wealth, and we're going to portion off a bit of it to help you guys out, which is one way of thinking about it.
Yeah.
But then that's a totally different question from like, just in the abstract, like in our economy or your economy or the global economy, how do we normally do things? How do we normally create all this wealth that we're going to distribute through either way? And I think the questions that Friedman and Keynes are talking about are much more to do with these kind of economic policy questions, whatever you call it, theoretical macroeconomic theory, as opposed to like, how do we help people in foreign countries who aren't as wealthy as we are? Like, there's just two really different ways of
thinking. Alex had a really great saying about this once, which is that, people ask, is UBI welfare? Well, the way we like to think about it is that the economy itself is the ultimate human welfare machine. So yeah, right. I mean, anything to do with economic management is kind of welfare, right? Because that's what the economy is there for. I think in the case of Give Directly, they absolutely started out in the world of international aid, where they are thinking, in that one frame of mind where we have to spend money, we want to help people as efficiently as we can with it. But then, because they were so efficient with the way they did that, just giving it directly to very poor people, that allowed them to do it at a very large scale, and then it started to have some kind of a macroeconomic relevance.
Well, yeah, and interestingly, if you are thinking of it in foreign aid, that's where, I don't know if you'd call it a multiplier effect, but the bang for your buck, that kind of comes into play. You're starting with a fixed amount of money that you're getting from rich people or donating it or something like that, and then you want to get the most possible effects for those dollars spent. Totally different from the question about like, oh, we're in abstract, we're managing the money supply. How do we do this?
Yeah, I think you're making an important distinction, Derek, which is there's kind of 2 points. There's what are we learning about the efficiency of kind of aid, foreign aid, and what are we learning about kind of the effects on the macroeconomy? And then in that second category, we can kind of break it down into, well, do we care about the questions that Milton Friedman and Keynes are asking? Or do we have our own other questions, which we really do? Like, we're not super interested in whether the amount of money in the economy, directly corresponds to the price level or something like that. And we're not super interested in kind of what the multiplier happens to be or something like that.
Really, a lot of people are. I mean, that's a common objection with UBI, is that it's going to cause inflation because you're flooding the economy with money. It's just it's helicopter money. You're dumping money on people. Oh, of course there'll be inflation, right? But they tried that here and there wasn't.
Right, but I mean, this isn't what I would point to for arguing with those people. I would say it's not about whether UBI causes inflation. Too much money causes inflation, no matter how it gets into the economy. The question is, what level of UBI is consistent with monetary stability, and also how does it compare to other mechanisms for distributing money into the economy?
Yeah, that's true.
Because it's like you can cause inflation with monetary policy too. You can cause it with just put too much money into the economy however you want, and there'll be inflation.
I think there's an assumption that earned money is different, and money has to be earned, and it should be earned. And if you're distributing money in a way that's not earned by labor, then that gets into dangerous territory and causes inflation.
Right, and I think the people who make this assumption don't realize that the jobs are make work, right? That it's not actually productive earning that's distributing the money.
That, and they also imagine that money always circulates indefinitely. The same dollar goes around and around and around, and it never stops being spent, right? And this is a lot what Milton Friedman and John Maynard Keynes were talking about there, right? And they talk about it more later on in the video. How much does the money circulate? And how does that affect our thinking, right? One of the major differences in how we think about money versus how other people think about it is that we don't imagine it circulating as much as other people do.
Right. We imagine it flowing through the economy in a direction. It gets added, it flows through, and then it goes away. It has a source and a destination.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's keep going.
No evidence that people who received cash became lazy, worked less, or spent the money on unproductive things like.
Okay, so it's normal for people to be lazy, to want to spend their time in leisure, right? That's okay. And it's also normal for people to, sell their labor less if they have another source of money and they don't have to sell their labor as much to get the money, right? So no evidence that they become lazy. Well, I guarantee you that if you give people enough money, and if that money is actually worth something and you're not causing inflation or something like that, that people are going to want to sell their labor less in general throughout the economy. And also, the flip side of this, and this is something that people often don't bring up with universal basic income, is that UBI not only reduces labor supply and that people don't want to work as much, it also reduces labor demand because we turn down that other faucet, that other money faucet of kind of job creation, stimulating the financial sector, that kind of thing. So people will work less because both the supply and the demand for labor will come down kind of in lockstep.
So it's about Goodhart's law and stuff, and being clear about what it is you really want. Do you really care that much? I mean, UBI advocates are always trying to talk about how it's going to create jobs and stuff because they're trying to sell it to people, and everybody assumes that's a good thing. But how many of them have actually questioned, is more jobs, more labor, more employment, is that really what you want? Or is it a means to an end, right? Surely the only reason we want employment is because employment is how stuff gets made. And we want to have nice things, and that's what we really want.
Yeah. And also unproductive spending is not in itself a bad thing, right? Like if I spend money on, just burning that money, maybe I didn't use up any resources. There's unproductive spending that could be like you used a bunch of resources and it didn't produce anything, and maybe that's wasteful. But unproductive on its own is not. Yeah.
Right here, when they say that, they're talking about like people spending on gambling and cigarettes and alcohol. Right, and that's an important. A lot of people have that objection. They think that they look at people on welfare right now. They're the existing example for people who receive money they haven't earned, and they're not particularly happy or healthy, and they spend it in ways that not only don't contribute to society but are damaging to themselves as well. So this is the role. This is the legit role that all the other smaller basic income pilots that we normally disparage actually have. We did need to prove to people that you can give free money to people, and they're not just gonna become degenerate losers and be depressed all the time.
We don't need to prove that, right? I think the economy needs money, and you want to distribute that in as an efficient way as possible, right?
Not if it results in everybody becoming depressed and
well, I think if people are spending money in ways that harm themselves, right, that is a separate problem. And there are ways to address that, right? You don't sabotage the whole economy's money distribution mechanism just to kind of prevent that.
Yeah,
right?
I really didn't like the term unproductive spending here as a euphemism for buying alcohol or cigarettes or stuff like that. I mean, like productive spending, I guess presumably that's what you do if you're going to start a business and you're buying
spending money to make
that
money,
you need to produce goods or to make profit or something like that. Whereas like if you're thinking more in an economics context, normally you'd think any of these things, whether it's groceries, t-shirts, alcohol, or whatever. I mean, these are consumer goods that people are producing, and so it's kind of weird. Like, what do you put into the category of unproductive spending? I guess like all consumer spending is unproductive. All you're doing it is buying goods, but of course those goods are being produced by someone else, so it's productive in that sense. So I'm not really sure. I don't know what that means.
That and the fact that like the whole point of doing the whole economy is so that people can buy nice things, right? If you get money from UBI and you spend it on something that's worth something to you, then that's the point of the entire endeavor, right? It shouldn't matter really whether it makes more money for yourself or not. The money is a means to an end. It's there precisely so that you can buy the things that you need and want.
Maybe this should say no evidence of people spending money in ways that harm themselves or something like that.
That'd be better, yeah.
Yeah, spending or something like that.
But even if there were evidence of that, that wouldn't be a reason not to do UBI. It would be a reason to help people who are having these problems. Maybe you could argue that the people who have these problems are the people who aren't going to earn money in the current system anyway. So the current system kind of only distributes money to people who aren't going to gamble it and spend all their money on alcohol and cigarettes. But I think in the real world, people who have a lot of money can also have gambling problems and addiction problems and that kind of thing. And we need resources for that. You don't want to muck around with the money distribution system as a way of, that's a blunt instrument, as a way of trying to prevent people from buying too much alcohol. That doesn't make sense.
Well, one way if I was going to speak to like maybe people that are interested in doing UBI advocacy or something like that, I mean, how I might phrase this is because people often counter the argument like, oh, we shouldn't give UBI to people because we're worried they're going to spend it on booze or something like that. And I guess it's very tempting if you're getting that argument to kind of shout back like, no, they won't do that, or you can look for studies to sort of prove this one way or the other. But the I guess what we're saying is you don't really need to do that. You can point out that people spending on products we consider to be harmful, that's a totally separate problem from the question of how people get their money in the first place.
Exactly. And there are studies and there is evidence you can cite that shows people spending their money in ways that harm themselves. So it's like that's just a rabbit hole you don't want to go down.
And if you do go down that rabbit hole, you're kind of implying that like if the studies came out a different way, like if people were spending it on cigarettes or whatever, then it would be a bad idea to do UBI. So you really want to be careful not to do that because that's doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to break your whole monetary system just because you're worried about people buying cigarettes.
Exactly. Yeah. All right.
Boost. In fact, there's now so much experimental evidence for the effectiveness of giving out cash that it could quickly become the default benchmark for doing development aid. For example, in a recent randomized controlled trial, Craig McIntosh and Andrew Zeitlin have found that in a nutrition program in Rwanda, it did not improve core child outcomes, while just giving the aid recipients $500 did improve child nutrition and growth. However, up to now, these studies could not tell us anything about macroeconomics. After all, if we want to study problems on an economy-wide scale, we need thousands of participants and millions, if not billions of dollars. Money that Scruffy University researchers simply do not have. This is where Give Directly came in, a charity that, thanks to generous donations, had just over $10 million that it could distribute. In a rich country, you cannot perform a proper macroeconomic experiment with $10 million. But in a poor area with average household incomes of just about $1,000 per year, this program represented a proper macroeconomic experiment, given that the $10 million represented roughly 50% of the area's GDP. On top of that, the study area is a relatively closed-off economy in which people travel to weekly markets, buy food, and mainly consume locally produced goods. So, how did Dr. Egger and his colleagues Johannes Haushofer, Ted Miguel, Paul Newhouse, and Michael Walker do a proper randomized
Can you turn the subtitles on?
a macroeconomic scale? Well, in this case,
What's that?
Can you turn the subtitles on? I think the volume's kind of low. I'm not sure
Oh,
it's going to
sure.
pick up much on the stream. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I just wanted to mention that they are asking macroeconomic questions, and they're maybe going to get some macroeconomic answers, but they're still not the macroeconomic questions that are really relevant to kind of whether UBI is going to be effective in the way that we think about it.
The treatment was a so-called unconditional cash transfer worth roughly $1,000 paid in 3 installments by Give Directly in the form of local currency payments directly to the phone of the head of households that were sufficiently poor to be eligible. But how were eligible households randomly assigned to either the intervention or control group? In my recent interview with him, Dr. Egger told me that randomization took place on 2 levels where
now we're sort of randomizing at the village level. We had 700 villages. Some villages get money. All of the eligible people in a treated village get money, and in a control village they don't. What we did on top of that is we had a second layer of randomization. So in some regions, 2/3 of villages were randomly chosen to receive money. In other regions, only 1/3 villages was treated.
This is how the researchers ended up with this map, which shows treated and control group villages. It also shows that in regions like this, a lot of villages were treated, while in regions like this, only a few villages got money. The first layer of randomization is basic for any randomized controlled trial. These groups should on average be the same thanks to the random selection. These villages all feel the effects of Kenya's broad economic trends like economic growth and inflation, or local trends like weather events that impact farming. However, due to the nature of macroeconomics, some money given to the treatment villages will automatically spill over to non-treated villages. Therefore, unlike a medicine experiment, non-treated subjects will also benefit from the treatment. To calculate how big the effect is, the researchers applied the second layer of randomization, where some areas have more treated villages than others. In high treatment areas, the researchers expected to see bigger spillover effects, such as more economic growth and inflation, than in low treatment areas. But was that actually the case? Thanks to a host of surveys asked to individuals, firms, and market participants before, during, and after the experiment, the economists were in a unique position of having extremely detailed information about all prices and transactions in the area over the course of 2.5 years. So what happened to this economy? Did give directly cash injection cause inflation, as Milton Friedman's theory would suggest, or did the economy expand by a multiple of the money introduced, as Keynes' theory suggests? Let's start with the most obvious one. What happened to inflation? Amongst many other things, Friedman theorized that inflation is typically caused by a rapid increase in the money supply. His reasoning is informed by the famous quantity theory of money, which states that if the rate at which people spend money is roughly stable and economic production does not increase, then blindly pumping a bunch of money into the economy will only raise prices.
So this is true. If the rate at which money is spent is stable and the production in the economy does not increase, then more money will cause a higher price level being spent. But, are those things true? Usually not.
Well, it's a bit actually it's not a bit odd, because if the rate at which money is spent is stable and production, isn't going anywhere either, then is spending stable or not? I guess you're assuming that the money that's created and is then spent, right? So it's not stable. It's more that it's rising, right, and production staying the same.
I think when they say rate of money spending, they talk about the velocity of money here, right? So the frequency at which a dollar gets spent.
At which a dollar gets spent. Okay, gotcha.
Right.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Frequency with the dollar gets spent is fixed, and you increase the number of dollars without increasing production. Then spending increases, but output does not.
And it's an assumption that the money circulates forever, right? Every dollar, once it's in the economy, it's going to get spent by a consumer a certain number of times per month, let's say, right? And the total consumer spending is then proportional to the amount of money that there is.
You can do it without that assumption. You can just say that the money supply is a flow, that there's a certain amount of money flowing through the economy. Or I guess it's still a stock, but there's you imagine that money is flowing through a river, and there's a certain amount of water in the river, and that's the money, right, in the economy. So there's always money being added and flowing, coming in from the source and flowing out at the bottom of the river. But kind of the quantity of water in the river is fixed or something like that. So it doesn't have to be that money is circulating to make this argument.
Very quick, we got a comment from the stream that we might as well answer. Someone asked, does UBI complement or undermine traditional welfare programs? That was from about 10 minutes ago. Thought we should.
This is a perennial question in the basic income community, isn't it? Gets a lot of pushback, right? Because people have their preferred solutions, and I do think basic income would make a lot of existing welfare things obsolete. I mean, you could leave them completely unchanged legally, but people wouldn't qualify for a lot of them anymore because they wouldn't be poor enough anymore, right?
Yeah, I mean, does it complement or undermine welfare programs? I think it's not. It doesn't really make sense to compare UBI to welfare programs, right? UBI is how the economy gets its money, and then welfare programs are assistance for people who are left behind, right? So they're kind of orthogonal to each other. And I think what Phil's saying is right, is that if your economy is functioning better, then fewer people get left behind, fewer people need assistance. So in that sense, you might see less uptake of welfare programs, that kind of thing.
The way I look at it right now is that we have this certain dream of how the economy is supposed to work, right? People picture, like they have this picture of like the best version of themselves, or we do the same thing with the economy, with society. We imagine a world where everybody has a good job and everybody earns a good living for themselves and nobody needs welfare, right? And then welfare is what we do when that fails to materialize in real life. It's like this sort of emergency sort of exception management thing where we give people money so they don't starve to death when they haven't got a job properly. But we imagine that wouldn't be necessary. And if we had basic income, then our picture of what an ideal economy looks like would be different. We wouldn't be imagining everybody gets most or all of their money by earning it necessarily anymore. And so and that particular model of how it could work, I think, would be more successful, and it wouldn't fail as much. You wouldn't need welfare.
Yeah, the way I like to put it is that that UBI is not a welfare program. It's not a safety net program. It's not cash assistance. It's just the way money flows into the economy.
Yeah.
And it's not an alternative to welfare programs because it's solving a different problem. It's solving the problem that's currently being solved by stimulating the labor market and kind of creating jobs that would otherwise be unnecessary and creating kind of easy or expansionary financial conditions that can be unstable, right? It's an alternative to that. It doesn't really belong in the same conversation with safety net stuff and welfare stuff.
I think the way I like to think about it is that welfare programs, social programs, in theory, these are mechanisms for addressing market externalities. Like the market system is doing stuff, but it's leaving holes, or it's not solving all the problems society wants to solve. So you need these other policies to come in, and UBI isn't that. It actually fixes the internal state of markets. So that means your markets are leaving fewer people behind in the first place. So that has implications for welfare policy, but it doesn't. It's not one or the other. It's really addressing a different problem. It's making the market system work better. We'll still probably need other policies to solve other problems, but UBI and making the market economy work better can actually help us figure out what problems can and can't a market solve. To begin with.
There are important problems that markets don't solve. There are important problems that universal basic income doesn't solve. But if you're living in an economy with money, you need a mechanism for distributing money into that economy. And UBI is one potential answer to the question of how should that money be distributed into the economy? Where does the economy's money come from, right? And where the economy's money comes from right now is fairly dysfunctional in various ways. UBI solves that problem. Okay. Oh, I see. Was there a comment was that on the Discord that you saw that, or was it in the?
Yeah, that was both on Twitch and on Discord.
Okay, perfect. All right, let us continue the video.
For example, assume just for the sake of simplicity that in Kenya's economy people go to the barber a lot. Barbershops are always full, but now a charity gives the poorest in society a lot of money. Now these people can go to the barber as well. It improves their lives for sure, but because the barbershops were already full, now not every customer can be helped. More demand than supply means that barbers will be able to raise their prices, and because getting a haircut dominates economic activity in this example, raising barbershop prices equals inflation. So, because the barbershops were already full, this money injection caused inflation. But crucially, it did not cause people to be actually better off on average. After all, the amount of haircuts given remains the same. Of course, in the long run, we might expect some unemployed people to become barbers, but this will take time. Using a more advanced version of this logic, Friedman famously said about inflation that
always and everywhere a result of too much money, of a more rapid increase in the quantity of money than an output.
In that same speech, he also said that
there is never in history.
So it's not wrong to say that inflation is always about too much money, right? You can always frame it that way.
You can always reduce the inflation by reducing the amount of money that people get, right? And that's what central banks do. They raise interest rates, businesses get less money, workers get less money, people spend less money, prices come down, right?
Yeah, you could also say inflation is always and everywhere about not enough production, right? And that would also not be wrong.
Yeah, and the problem is that he's talking. I mean, he confuses the stock and the flow of money, right? It's true to say that if the prices are too high, you can lower them by lowering the flow of money. That's not quite the same as like lowering the stock of money, though, right? You're not necessarily going to have a too high a flow of money because you increase the stock.
Well, I think in his thinking, the stock and the flow go together. So you reduce the flow, it reduces the stock. You reduce the stock, it reduces the flow. Yeah.
But the major point here is that if you're just picking at one side or the other of the equation, if you're just looking at output or you're just looking at spending, however you conceive of spending, you're never going to have a comprehensive story about what one of those things leading to inflation. It can't be comprehensive because these things can move independently. The only way you know for sure whether or not there's inflation is whether or not these things are rising together or not. If they're moving independently, you can get loss of price stability. If they're moving together, then you can't. So I guess that's kind of my issue with that either way of framing it, saying like, oh, falling production can lead to inflation or rising spending can lead to inflation. Like, well, no, neither of those necessarily does.
Yeah, there's always two sides to the
Yeah.
inflation equation, just like there are always two sides to the price equation. There's the spending, and then there's what it's buying, right?
It's not just that he's ignoring the production side though. He's also sort of implying by focusing on the stock that, say you had like a modest basic income and it wasn't creating like a massive amount of spending. It was only a small percentage increase in spending per month, let's say, but it's all newly created money. And so that means that over time, the stock is going to keep gradually increasing. And even though the rate of basic income doesn't go up, eventually, when the stock gets to a certain level, it's going to trigger some kind of inflation, right? I feel like that's the assumption that people make when they're on the quantity theory of money. It's about like, can you do this thing long term, or is it like, is it again when you confuse the rate of spending with the amount of money that's in the economy? You can keep the rate of money creation constant, but the amount of money is going to go up over time. And if people think that's what matters, then eventually it's going to reach some threshold and cause inflation, right?
Well, the quantity theory of money is compatible with money flowing out of the economy. So if it's flowing in at the same rate that it's flowing out, then you're going to have a fixed money supply.
Let's say it's not flowing out.
If it's not flowing out, then yes, you're just adding more and more money to the economy. And it's, kind of continually circulating, yeah.
When you say flowing out of the economy, though, do you mean like it's leaving the country and going to a different country, or could you mean that like it's being hoarded and then it doesn't get spent anymore, and that counts as flowing out for you?
Well, for me, being hoarded counts as flowing out. I think the simplest kind of way to think about it is taxes.
Specify that next time.
Well, the simplest way to think about it is taxes, right? And that's the kind of the simplest framing. Is that the government spends money into the economy and taxes money out. If it's the same amount, then you have a balanced budget, and the amount of money in the economy isn't growing. Now, if you doubled the amount the government was spending and you doubled the amount they were taxing, that would double prices, even in this scenario. But if you're imagining that there's kind of a pool of money in the economy that is circulating, and the spending is adding to it, and the taxing is kind of siphoning some of it off, if it's at the same level, then you could imagine, money's flowing out and money's flowing in, and
a zero net flow.
Balanced. Yeah. Anyway, I want to be fair to some of the quantity theory people, that they do think about taxes sometimes as kind of removing money from the economy and that kind of thing. I don't know that they.
Yeah, sure. Of course.
All right, I keep clicking that by accident.
They probably don't think of savings or accumulated money as flowing out in the way that you might.
Right, that's the difference, right?
Which is an interesting perspective. I hadn't thought about it that way, but I guess it's flowing out of the particular flow of money that's relevant to price formation. That's true.
Yes. Yeah. And sometimes it's flowing back to the government, right? Like if people are saving by buying treasuries, right? Then it's, it flows back to the government, and then the government spends it again. You can tell the story about how it's like the same money circulating. It's just, I don't think it's as informative of a framing. I don't think it's going to get to kind of the core of what's going on. All right,
let's keep going.
Yeah.
Logic, you'd expect that the result of the $10 million distributed by Give directly was either that people work more hours, or that it would cause inflation, or at least a combination of these two. But this is not what happened. Instead, Dr. Egger and his colleagues observed that the intervention caused hardly any inflation at all. Treated villages did not have higher inflation than untreated villages, and high-intensity treatment areas had about the same inflation as low-intensity areas. So then, based on Friedman's framework, the researchers expected that they would see a big increase in hours worked. But digging deeper into their data, Egger and his colleagues were surprised to discover that while working hours of both recipients and non-recipients increased slightly, the effect was so small that it was not statistically significant. So what happened? Was Friedman wrong? Not entirely. To find out what was going on, Egger and his colleagues dove deeper into their data and observed that in Kenya, by far, most firms are operated by a single person. In these types of firms, people officially work the whole day, but in practice, they don't have much customers during much of the day. So we need to change our barber example. In this case, the barbers did not have enough customers. In econ speak, I would say this economy was constrained by demand, or there was slack in the economy. So if now again a charity comes in to drop some cash, again demand will increase, but prices will not increase since these barbers had so few customers that they could easily absorb the extra demand without raising their prices. So as in the barbershop example, GiveDirectly's big money injection in this area did not cause inflation because the extra demand it generated was immediately matched by extra supply by small entrepreneurs who did not have enough customers. Therefore, I would argue that his statement about inflation that
There has never in history been an extremely rapid increase in the quantity of money without an inflation.
has now been proven wrong by this experiment. There was clearly a rapid increase in the supply of money and no inflation. That being said, if we go back to Friedman's statement that inflation
It's always and everywhere a result of too much money, of a more rapid increase in the quantity of money than an output.
then we see that this could still be true. After all, you could say in this case there was no inflation because while the money supply increased rapidly, this was matched by an equally rapid increase in the economic output because there was so much slack in this economy. So now the question becomes, will that increase in economic output be equal to or more than the increase in money? That is
So this is interesting. It sounds like there are a bunch of barbershops that aren't getting enough customers, and maybe it's like opening up a barbershop, you kind of maybe there are some that are successful and others that aren't, like these upstart entrepreneurs or something like that, and everyone's kind of trying to make it big as a barber, and a few people do and other people don't, but it just means that there's like a lot of extra capacity that is not being activated.
Oh, so it's a demand-constrained economy, right? Which is what they say later, and that's the thing that we've talked
Yeah.
about, right?
But you could have a demand-constrained economy where there just aren't any barbershop. There aren't very many barbershops because there's not enough demand for those barbershops, right? So then you
Right,
open new barbershops. But this is interesting because there actually are all these barbershops that just don't have very many customers. Yeah.
Yes, I think the implementation of the Slack can be a little bit different, right? You could have people who just aren't doing anything, and then they suddenly start businesses when there's customers. Or you have, like, apparently in practice, there was a lot of businesses where the shopkeeper just sort of sits there most of the day and gets like 3 customers, but still it exists. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Let's continue.
is the essence of the second famous theory, which is the Keynesian multiplier. The multiplier concept was introduced by British economist John Maynard Keynes in his influential book, The General Theory of Employment, Interests and Money in 1936. In his book, Keynes theorized that an initial injection of money into an economy by the government can lead to a larger overall increase in employment, income and spending as the money circulates. This is because when one person spends money, it becomes income for another person, who then spends a portion of it, and so on. However, because most people save a bit of their income every time, and because some people spend some of it in neighboring economies, some new money will continuously leak out of the economy until all of it is spent. Notably, because poor people spend more of the money that they get, typically, than rich people, Keynes predicted that the multiplier is larger in a poor community. Therefore, according to this theory, the cash introduction by GiveDirectly should increase the local economy by more than the money introduced.
So another way of saying this is that it's similar to kind of people save money and it flows out of the economy, and that if you give money to the people who are already rich, then it starts already not in the economy, and if you give it to poor people, then it actually flows through the full thing. So that's one way of thinking about the multiplier.
Okay, I can imagine that if you have a place where there's a lot of small businesses rather than a small number of large businesses, then probably the money's going to circulate a little bit more there, right? Because I don't know. Well, it's more common to be a business owner, I guess. So if the money flows up within one of these individual businesses where it gets spent, then well, there's a more like ordinary people who are collecting the money. Whereas, you know, if there's just like 10 corporations that provide everything, then not much of the money is going to come back down. But that doesn't matter for UBI, right? Because the money itself isn't what's limited.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And it also doesn't matter for UBI that, you know, you give it to rich people and it doesn't have much of a multiplier, because then it just does nothing. That means you can still give more money to poor people. It doesn't take away from the money you're giving to everyone else.
Yeah.
Whoops. I lost where we are. It goes around here.
Interests and money in 1936. In his book, Keynes theorized and for another person out of a community. Therefore, according to this theory, the cash introduction by Give Directly should increase the local economy by more than the money introduced. In other words, the multiplier should be quite a bit bigger than 1. By following up all transactions over 2.5 years and by comparing low to high treatment areas, Egger and his team calculated that overall GDP was boosted by just over $2.5 for each dollar distributed by Give Directly. That means that cash transfers were much more effective than you would have guessed if you had just looked at the direct impact on people who got the money. This finding could have massive implications for development aid, which in previous decades came under intense scrutiny for how every dollar donated, only a fraction ever reached the poor people for which it was intended. In reaction to this scrutiny, a new, much simpler, more direct way of doing development aid was pioneered by groups like Give Directly. What if you just send money directly to the poorest people on the planet on their phone? And if they don't have a phone, then you can just give them a phone. Of course, as you can see here, there are still a few costs involved here, such as financial transaction costs, the cost of following up, and buying people a SIM card and potentially a phone. But using this approach, people actually receive most of the money that is donated, and it is clear to the donor exactly where the costs are being made. This is great in itself, but what's even better is that the study that we discussed today shows that dollars that do reach the recipients benefit the economy by roughly 2.5 times. This adds to the ever-increasing pile of evidence that every dollar you donate via an unconditional cash transfer program ends up benefiting people by much more than the donated dollar to traditional aid programs. This study and Give Directly's work in general got me really excited for 2 reasons. First, their program represents the best way to actually help really poor people that I've seen so far. And second, their work with researchers like Egger is helping us finally scientifically test some of macroeconomics' biggest unsolved mysteries. This is why for this video I've decided to work with Give Directly directly. You see, I started this channel back in 2020 with the aim of providing more accessible information to people all over the world about their economies, with the hope that they would use this knowledge to actually improve their economies. However, in an economy like that of Kenya that is demand constrained, I think this study has shown that you have to wonder if training sessions or videos like mine will even help if people don't have money to start a business and customers don't have money to buy their products. This could explain why so many randomized controlled trials have found that giving free stuff for training is likely not the most effective way to help. Giving cash has proven benefits for recipients with spillovers to their neighbors. Therefore, as we're nearing the holiday season in much of the rich world, I would like to urge you, on top of buying some gifts for your loved ones who possibly already have a lot, please consider supporting a new village in rural Kenya through Give Directly by using the YouTube fundraiser feature on the right of the screen, or by giving to givedirectly.org/macro. If you support Give Directly, your money will be delivered to all 164 families in this village next year. The recipients can themselves decide how they will spend the money. Isaiah, for example, says that he will spend it on school fees for his kids. Jennifer plans to restart her fishing business.
Okay, we don't need to watch this. Okay. Yeah.
What can we conclude from this, right? I think that's how we should try and wrap up. Like, what actual evidence do we think that this really constitutes? It seems significant to me because I often like to. I mean, you know, as one of us, I'm often saying that, you know, that the economy is demand constrained, and that we could actually probably quite easily make quite a bit more stuff if people always had the money with which to buy it, right? And that's exactly what they found empirically right here, right?
Yeah, I mean, just because the economy is demand constrained in villages in rural Africa doesn't mean it's demand constrained here.
It proves that it is a thing and it can happen, at least, right?
Yeah, and I mean, I think it is something that is happening, and the way we kind of demonstrate that is through that graph in the what's that paper? The
Natural rate of basic income.
natural rate of basic income paper. Yeah.
That graph.
Yeah. And that just comes from the way monetary policy works and the way it affects the demand curve, right? So you want to flatten out the demand. I don't think you can use this as evidence of that, but you can theoretically kind of demonstrate it. But it's also not that important. I mean, it's kind of important, but it's.
I mean, that graph makes the assumption that we're not currently at Q max right now, right?
Yeah.
And some people might say, well, how do you know that we're not at Qmax? Well, we have at least this one example where an economy was not at Qmax, and we gave it more money and more stuff got made pretty quickly.
Well, the other way we know is that we use monetary policy to distribute money in a way that's very skewed, right?
I suspect you're correct, but it's a little bit more tenuous and harder to see things that way, I think.
I mean, you can use this as evidence for Africa, but you can't use it as evidence for the United States, I don't think. Like, do we have a bunch of barbershops that are just one guy sitting around and he gets 3 customers? I mean, maybe.
Well, the other thing I worry about the demand versus supply constraint, and it depends how people use the terms, but just it's not the case that I think it can give people the impression sometimes that like, oh, there's this slack in the economy, and really just what it needs is more spending, right? But that's a totally different question from about how are we spending. If you imagine that you've picked a lever and you're maximizing demand so that there's no more supply that can now meet demand through that lever, is that supply constrained or demand constrained? You know what I mean? In the case of UBI, you can imagine total spending being kind of the same, but now you're switching out one form of spending for another. So you're supporting consumer demand in a more efficient way than you were before. So that's where, I mean, the concept of slack can be a little bit misleading, because it's not really about like, oh, there's not enough. Because if it was really a case of there's just straight up not enough spending like itself, then you might expect to see deflation, right? You might expect to see some of those kinds of problems. And then, okay, through one mechanism or another, let's just add spending to the economy to fix it. Whereas I think what we're talking about is comparing 2 different policies for facilitating total spending. And then you're comparing those 2 policies, like which is the better way for production to support aggregate demand. We're kind of taking for granted that you're going to support aggregate demand either way. And I'm not sure everyone else is looking at it that way.
UBI isn't about adding more money to the economy. It's about having a different money source for the economy.
Yeah, that's a good point. You don't have to have slack for UBI to be necessary and to make sense.
Right. Exactly. And you probably will, right? If resources are being allocated inefficiently now, they're going to be allocated more efficiently if we distribute money more efficiently, right? But that's kind of a second order thing. The main thing is like, what's the kind of most efficient money distribution mechanism?
Right. If we're inefficient now, then spending stays the same, and you swap out UBI for monetary policy, and then we get more production. We get a production bonus. If there's also slack, then you get the same bonus, but then you also get more spending, total spending overall. The UBI goes up higher than you thought it would. So that's maybe how I would think about it.
Yeah, and the inefficiency of the money distribution limits how much money we actually can distribute as well, right? And if we're capped in how much money we can distribute, then you might well suspect that it could be that we could handle a lot more spending. We've just never been able to find that out before. We've never been able to distribute enough money.
This is sort of related, but at the end here, it's really important to emphasize. I mean, this video he posted was almost about UBI, but not really. It was really about like helping the poor, but then he's sneaking in this macroeconomic stuff. And whether you're seeing direct cash or unconditional cash is like, I think this video overall, my issue with it is we're still looking at UBI as, we're still looking at free money as a way to help the poor. And then you're hoping it doesn't have these other effects that might hurt the average person, like inflation or something like that, right? And that's super different from how we're looking at UBI, which is an economic policy straight up to begin with. It's something if you're looking at UBI to help the poor, that means you're not thinking about UBI as a way to help the average person, as an alternative to the existing income distribution system for everybody. For you, me, everybody you know. Maybe we're poor, maybe we're not. You know, like UBI helps the whole system work better. That's totally different. The questions you're going to ask are totally different. That the empirical studies that you would run would be different. And this leads me to one question for you, Alex. Like, let's say that you were given this amount of money to distribute into a similar, a poor economy where it could go further and cover a wide area. I'm curious, like, would you arrange it differently? The way that they built this study, and the kind of what they were looking for. I mean, how would it be different if you were going to be in charge of an empirical study like that?
I mean, I'd probably do this, but I wouldn't be studying UBI. I'd be studying the effectiveness of bang for your buck with foreign aid or something like that.
Well, this is the question: can we design, like, assume enough of a budget? Like, can you empirically test a UBI? What does that look like?
How big does it have to be?
UBI implementation in a certain country?
It has to be. I mean, you test it by doing it, right? It has to be at the level of the monetary zone, right?
What does that mean?
It means that if you wanted to do a US dollar UBI, it would have to be going. It would have to have be able to trade off against monetary policy. Like you'd have to be able to say, okay, now the Fed can tighten interest rates or something like that. If it's just some, I mean, I don't even know what the currency is in Kenya, to be honest. And I don't know, like they're donating dollars and then converting them into local currency, presumably. And I'd be interested in that kind of stuff. But I don't think it's testing the kinds of things that okay, so it didn't cause inflation. Did it cause the Kenyan central bank to raise interest rates or prevent them from lowering interest rates or something like that? Like those are the kinds of questions I'm interested in.
Right. That would be really interesting.
Yeah.
And I guess maybe that's what I was getting at. Like in this study, and the way a lot of UBI or other cash studies are designed is like, the way they did the randomization here was that you're trying to get similar individuals, similar households or villages, and then you look at these at that level. You look at the village level or the household level, but really an empirical test of an unconditional income, a universal income, would be to do it across a region or a country or a currency zone, ideally. And then that's your test, right? You're looking at, you can look at inflation, you look at interest rates, and everywhere else in the world that didn't do it is your control. You know what I mean? If you're really thinking in a macro sense, that's sort of how you would have to do it.
You'd need an economy that has a well-developed financial sector, right? Because that's what you're trading off against, right?
Yeah.
I agree that to truly test basic income as we see it, it would need to be done at a scale that's big enough that it could potentially affect the whole country's monetary policy, right? And it sounds like this wasn't quite big enough for that. It was like some county in Kenya. It would need to be like the whole country or something. Still, having said that, like a lot of people would have assumed that if you dump a ton of money on a closed-off community like this, that's going to cause inflation because you're flooding the place with money, right? And it didn't.
Well, I got to go, but I don't think this give directly thing is useful for us or useful for UBI supporters. But I'm happy to chat more about it in the chat.
All right.
See you guys.
You, Alex. Phil, we can keep talking about that. I just was curious because I wanted to get more in on that too, because I see both sides of this. Like I totally get where Alex is coming from, that you kind of have to do it, to test it, especially if you're thinking about it as a trade-off of monetary policy. If you want to test what we study, what the questions we're asking.
Yeah.
At the same time, I get where you're coming from. Like if you have this $10 million, which becomes X amount in the local currency, right, of a comparatively poorer nation, and you try to cover a wide area, does that at least give us some insight about testing like Keynesian theories versus monetarist theories of inflation, or testing monetarist theories of inflation versus how we think about it, income theory, that sort of stuff? Like, and I don't know, because you could think about it, right? Like, let's say you just picked a region of a country and you did it out based on the region. It was a significant amount of money. Like, and let's say you found there was no inflation in that region. Are we saying in that case that like money is now, it was absorbed by that region and now there's more production, so prices didn't go up? But couldn't someone else say like, well, really, what if you look elsewhere in the country? Look at the other region next door. Prices went up there, and the central bank.
Well, they did look at the regions next door, though, right? And there wasn't inflation there either, is what they said.
Across the whole country, I'm guessing if you're like, you could say there's a reallocative effect, that like somewhere else in the economy, in the market, someone's paying for it. Because the way I think about it, people who really advocate for that view, which I'm not one, but the way they tend to think about it is like, there's this guy on Twitter I was talking a lot with the other day, but like they really like to emphasize that like anytime the government spends money, it's a cost to the average person. Someone pays the cost in markets, is what they're saying. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they assume. I mean, they assume that all money has to be earned. Otherwise, if you haven't earned that money yourself, somebody else has earned it for you, right? If you haven't paid the cost for that money that you got by laboring and suffering for it, somebody else somewhere has, and then like it's been taxed off them and given to you, or maybe there's some complicated process by which it gets reallocated to you, but somewhere somebody else has to be paying for it, right? And they didn't find that in this case. It does seem to me like a point against that argument. Alex has certain questions that he's asking himself and that we're asking ourselves about how to do basic income and how should basic income work. But there's also certain things that we believe about how basic income would work and how the economy works that other people disagree with. And this study to me seems like a point in favor of those things. You know, when Urey concludes that this seems like a point against Friedman's assumption that more money equals more inflation, that seems pretty legit to me, right?
That's fair, but then what would you say to someone who granted the findings and then said, well, you know, what's really happening is you're just reallocating resources from wealthier economies to this poorer economy. So someone in England, someone in America, they're paying for it, you know, which
That's a
is
good
actually,
point, because they
which
definitely
is
are.
actually true in this case.
Yeah, it is true. It is true.
Right. That's and maybe there's various empirical or more detailed reasons about like why we might find that argument compelling or not. You could go then chase that rabbit hole. But I guess I'm pointing out like the goalposts can always be moved, and then if you're really thinking in terms of theory or like the economy as a system, and the average person, which is kind of who we typically think about, that's this big abstract thing, and it's hard. I think it's hard to find evidence that would really convince someone out of that perspective, if that's sort of the perspective they were taking, that it necessarily was a reallocation.
I guess what I would say to them is that, you know, this economy where they dumped the money in Kenya was like sort of mostly separated from the rest of the world, and it's like it's hard to see how things would have gone differently at the treatment side if, let's say, you know, if the money had been printed by the West instead of actually donated or something, right? Would it have gone differently then? Like how would it have had a different effect inside that economy? If it, are they saying that it wouldn't have worked if it hadn't cost people in the West? How exactly? What would I mean, this recipient side is like separated from where the money comes from, right? If they're saying that, you know, the money has to you know, come out of somebody else's pocket and disenfranchise someone in order for it to benefit anybody else, how exactly does that work? How would it not be working anymore if the West had printed the money and just given it to them, right?
You could imagine a lot of what if we printed it in the local currency? You know, what if the
Yeah,
US dollar prints
that
it
as
and
well.
then
That as well.
and that you forex it? So like there's a lot of, you can get into the weeds with that. But I guess like from a higher level, it's also true that um if a policymaker wants to cause inflation with UBI, they can do it, and for the same
Yeah,
exact reason that that's possible, they cannot do it. They can
yeah. Right.
decide not to
There's
do
a
it.
certain
But
amount
what
of
are you
money.
studying? You know, like if you were to try to empirically study it, like when I was saying to Alex before, hypothetically, let's say we could do this on a countrywide level. What are we studying exactly? Like whether or not we can, like, because if you calibrate it, you devoid it, and so it's a little bit, it's a little bit tough. It's kind of like when you're talking about a policy decision. It's kind of like saying, you know, will my right hand go punch the wall and hurt my fingers? You know, like
Well,
you
it
can
might
do
not
that.
prove anything to us. It would prove something to other people, I think, if we were to do such an experiment.
Yes, that's how I think about these experiments. I think they're maybe they'll get people to be more curious about UBI, and then they'll look up the theory. But
Yeah.
I don't know. Anyway, good to see you again. Should we we'll close this out? We can go to the other room.
Yeah, sure, let's do that. Okay.
Okay, see ya.